On the 16th of December 1944, in the pre-dawn stillness of Monschau, Germany, the frozen ground itself began to hum, then to shudder, as a fresh symphony of American artillery tore through the air above. Yet this morning's barrage was different, a terrifying and incomprehensible departure from the known rules of war. The shells were not carving craters into the earth or splintering the ancient trees. They were erupting in mid-air, bursting with perfect timing directly over the heads of advancing German formations, unleashing a lethal, inescapable downpour of steel fragments against which no foxhole offered sanctuary. Within the ranks of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, as they lunged at the positions of the 38th Cavalry Squadron, even soldiers who had stared down death for years on the brutal Eastern Front now faced a phenomenon that shattered their entire understanding of combat. These were not the familiar artillery patterns they had learned to survive, the predictable rhythm of impacts, the fleeting pockets of safety, the trusted shelter of an entrenchment. This was something new, a form of death administered from the heavens with chilling mathematical precision. In that very moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had just committed to one of the most pivotal and unauthorized acts of the Battle of the Bulge. In direct defiance of standing orders and without a whisper of permission from his superiors, he had commanded his gun crews to load shells armed with the most fiercely protected secret in the entire Allied arsenal: proximity fuses. These miraculous devices, each containing a miniature radar set capable of sensing its altitude above the target and detonating at the most lethal possible height, were about to amplify the deadliness of artillery by a staggering factor of 50. In the snow-dusted forests of the Ardennes, the very mathematics of death were being furiously rewritten. What the German soldiers could never have known was that they had become the first to encounter a weapon so profoundly revolutionary it would not only reshape this single battle, but the very essence of warfare for all time to come. The storm had truly been unleashed. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Wehrmacht's audacious last gamble, had commenced with an overwhelming surge of promise. Hitler's desperate offensive hurled 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces through the fog-shrouded secrecy of the Ardennes. The Führer had personally guaranteed his generals that this colossal assault would shatter the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and decisively turn the tide of a war that was slipping inexorably into the abyss of defeat. The initial bombardment, erupting at 05:30 hours on December 16th, had achieved a flawless tactical surprise, with German artillery hammering the 85-mile front at a relentless rate of 1,600 rounds per minute. American intelligence had suffered a catastrophic, near-total failure. The massive German buildup had gone utterly undetected, leaving many frontline units composed of either unblooded replacements or weary veterans sent to this supposedly quiet sector for a much-needed rest. But at Monschau, Colonel Axelson was staring into the face of an impossible tactical nightmare. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small and lightly armed reconnaissance unit, was being systematically crushed by vastly superior German numbers. Conventional artillery was proving utterly incapable of halting the relentless assault. It was in this crucible of desperation that Axelson made his historic, career-risking choice: unleash the top-secret proximity-fused shells. Authorization be damned. He knew he would almost certainly face a court-martial for this flagrant insubordination. But in that critical moment, he also knew with absolute certainty that to follow orders was to guarantee a catastrophic defeat. The result was instantaneous and utterly devastating. German soldiers, advancing in their well-drilled assault formations, were suddenly consumed by a kind of fire beyond their darkest imaginings. The shells exploded with terrifying consistency, 30 to 50 feet above their heads, each detonation creating a perfect cone of shrapnel that saturated an area vastly larger than any conventional ground-bursting shell could ever hope to cover. Hardened veterans who had mastered the art of taking cover from normal artillery were scythed down in their foxholes. Behind trees, in ditches, everywhere they desperately sought shelter was transformed into a killing ground. The secret science of death had arrived. The proximity fuse was the stunning culmination of American scientific genius and industrial might operating at their absolute zenith. While conventional shells relied on direct impact or imprecise time fuses that frequently detonated at the wrong altitude, the proximity fuse housed a complete self-contained radar system no bigger than a can of coffee. Within the confines of each fuse, American engineers had ingeniously packed 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on the model, all hardened to withstand the unbelievable 20,000 times gravity force of being blasted from an artillery cannon. The physics at play were simply mind-bending. At the instant of firing, the colossal acceleration shattered a tiny glass ampule filled with electrolyte, instantly creating a wet cell battery that powered the minuscule radar for the duration of the shell's flight. Dr. Merle Fuze at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had spearheaded this monumental effort with an intensity that rivaled the Manhattan Project itself. The laboratory, cunningly disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, employed a staggering 3% of all American physicists at the project's peak. The security measures were every bit as stringent as those surrounding the atomic bomb. Workers were forbidden from discussing their work, even with their own families, and every single fuse was stamped with a unique serial number for meticulous tracking. The technical hurdles had at first seemed utterly insurmountable. Vacuum tubes originally designed for living room radios had to be completely re-engineered from the ground up to survive the brutal launch from a cannon. They needed to function flawlessly while spinning at extreme rotational velocities, operate in every conceivable weather condition, and be sensitive enough to detect targets without detonating prematurely. The crucial breakthrough arrived through pioneering miniaturization techniques that would later ignite a revolution in the entire electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen's incredible tubes were no larger than pencil erasers, yet they contained all the essential elements of conventional radio tubes. By December of 1944, American factories were churning out an astonishing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Over 100 different companies contributed to this colossal effort, from industrial giants like RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and the Crosley Corporation. The program's total cost soared to $1 billion in 1940s currency, a sum second only to the Manhattan Project in all of wartime spending. Axelson's unauthorized deployment on December 16th triggered an immediate crisis in the chain of command. He had directly violated orders that strictly limited the proximity fuses to anti-aircraft roles, a restriction born from the deep-seated fear that a captured shell might be reverse-engineered by German scientists. But the weapon's devastating, undeniable effectiveness at Monschau could not be ignored. The German attack had been stopped dead in its tracks, with casualty rates that sent shockwaves through both sides of the conflict. Word of the new weapon's incredible impact raced up to Supreme Headquarters with astonishing speed. General Eisenhower, recognizing the desperate and deteriorating situation across the whole of the Ardennes, formally requested authorization for their use on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions had been swept aside, and proximity fuses were officially released for general ground combat use across the entire Battle of the Bulge. The rapid distribution that ensued was a stunning testament to American logistical supremacy. Within mere days, crates of proximity-fused shells were being rushed to artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received its precious allocation just as the German steel ring was closing tight around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with its formidable M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, began employing them to defend the northwest approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, a segregated African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, used them with devastating precision southwest of Bastogne. Every single unit that received them discovered the same earth-shattering truth. Proximity fuses transformed artillery from a mere support weapon into a truly decisive instrument of battle. Forward observers no longer needed to painstakingly adjust fire for effect. The fuses themselves would find their own optimal point of detonation. The need for pinpoint accuracy plummeted while the sheer lethality skyrocketed exponentially. The siege of Bastogne became the ultimate showcase for the proximity fuse's power in defensive warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, completely encircled and hopelessly outnumbered, grimly held the vital crossroads against wave after wave of furious German assaults. Their crucial artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers capable of firing the new proximity-fused shells. Between the 19th and 31st of December, official unit records show the 463rd fired exactly 7,606 rounds. While not all of these were proximity-fused, due to the initially limited supply, those that were inflicted devastating psychological and physical carnage. German assault formations seemed to simply melt away beneath the air-bursting barrages, with entire platoons being wiped from existence in a matter of seconds. The German attack on December 22nd, which followed General McAuliffe's famously defiant "nuts" reply to the surrender demand, perfectly highlighted the weapon's terrifying effectiveness. German infantry, advancing across the snow-blanketed fields in traditional formations, were caught completely in the open. The proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with perfect, ungodly timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that left absolutely no safe zones. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally vital role in the defense. Their massive 155mm howitzers forged a ring of death around Bastogne's perimeter the German forces found utterly impenetrable. The larger shells, detonating at a height of 50 feet, saturated even greater areas with a blizzard of lethal fragments. German prisoners captured later recounted that attacking units often lost all cohesion before they even reached the American lines, with soldiers breaking and fleeing in terror from the incomprehensible air bursts. Perhaps the most chillingly documented demonstration of the proximity fuse's lethality occurred at the Sauer River near Echternach on the 25th and 26th of December. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving relentlessly north to relieve the besieged forces at Bastogne, personally witnessed this engagement and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion, attempting to cross the partially frozen river, believed themselves perfectly concealed by the thick darkness and swirling fog from any American observers. Traditional artillery would have demanded a slow and careful adjustment of fire, giving the Germans precious time to finish their crossing or scramble for cover. But the proximity-fused shells required no such calibration. Patton wrote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new posit ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. The river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies." This figure, 702 killed by an actual physical count, stands as one of the few precisely documented casualty reports from proximity fuse employment. The mathematical efficiency was both stark and horrifying. A single battalion had essentially ceased to exist in a matter of minutes, with absolutely no possibility of escape or defense. The psychological shockwave from this slaughter radiated throughout German units in the sector, with soldiers beginning to refuse direct orders to conduct any further river crossings. The dense forests of the Ardennes, which the Germans had relied upon for concealment and cover, were horrifically transformed into inescapable death traps the moment proximity fuses entered the equation. In open terrain, a fuse detonating at 30 to 50 feet was deadly enough, but in the forests, its effects were multiplied exponentially. The air bursts ripped through the tree canopies, shattering branches and creating thousands of additional wooden projectiles. These razor-sharp splinters, some as long as a man's arm, flew through the air at hundreds of feet per second with lethal force. Traditional defensive positions, such as taking cover behind large trees or digging foxholes beneath sprawling root systems, became utterly useless. The fragments and splinters now rained down from directly above, instantly negating centuries of tactical wisdom about forest combat. American artillery units quickly grasped this terrifying multiplier effect. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell detonating above the forest canopy could effectively scour an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. The ghastly combination of metal fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from the trees created a 360-degree kill zone that no amount of tactical skill could possibly evade. German units, expertly trained in the art of forest warfare, discovered their hard-won expertise was now completely worthless. Spreading out to avoid concentrated casualties only made their units more vulnerable to the wide area effects, while bunching together for mutual support meant that entire squads could be annihilated by a single, perfectly placed shell. There was simply no correct tactical 1940s. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter that operated between 180 and 220 MHz, continuously emitting radio waves that reflected off any solid object in their path: the ground, trees, vehicles, even human bodies. As the shell hurtled towards its target, the reflected signal grew stronger. When this signal reached a predetermined intensity, corresponding to the optimal burst height, a sensitive electronic switch instantly triggered the detonation. This entire delicate system had to function under physical conditions that would obliterate any normal electronics. During the firing sequence, the acceleration peaked at 20,000 times Earth's gravity, enough force to crush a human body to microscopic thinness. The shells spun at rates that generated immense centrifugal forces. Temperatures fluctuated wildly from the 3,000 degrees heat of the gun barrel to the sub-zero cold at the peak of their trajectory. And yet the fragile vacuum tubes, protected by innovative cushioning systems, not only survived but functioned with an incredible reliability rate of over 80%. The optimal burst heights had been meticulously determined through exhaustive testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. For 105mm howitzers, the standard divisional artillery piece, 30 feet proved to be ideal. The larger 155mm guns achieved their maximum lethality at 50 feet. The rare, colossal 240mm shells created devastating effects at 70 feet or more, capable of clearing entire grid squares of enemy forces. This technological superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance. Post-war studies conclusively showed that proximity fuses increased lethality by 5 to 10 times over conventional shells, and the lethal fragment area increased by a factor of 50. Anti-aircraft applications revealed even more dramatic improvements. The success rate for shooting down V-1 flying bombs leaped from 17% to an astounding 79% within weeks of the proximity fuse's deployment. The German intelligence failure concerning the proximity fuse proved to be nothing short of catastrophic. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot, capturing approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This incredible intelligence windfall should have immediately triggered the development of urgent countermeasures. Instead, German technical experts examined the captured fuses and confidently declared them to be impossible fakes. The very presence of vacuum tubes inside an artillery shell contradicted everything German engineers believed they knew about the limitations of electronics and ballistics. They wrongly concluded that the Americans must be using some form of magnetic detection, or that the visible components were merely decoys designed to hide the real, unknown mechanism. This failure of imagination stemmed partly from a deep-seated institutional blindness. Germany had, in fact, led the world in proximity fuse development before the war, with Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin producing working prototypes as early as 1940, but Hitler's infamous order, canceling all weapons projects that required more than 6 months to reach production, had abruptly terminated the entire program. German engineers simply could not bring themselves to believe that the Americans had solved the very problems they themselves had abandoned as insurmountable. The irony deepened when one considers Germany's own formidable technical capabilities. Their electrostatic proximity fuses, which used changes in electrical capacitance rather than radar, had shown a 95% reliability in tests. Had their development continued, Germany might well have fielded its own proximity fuses by 1941. Hermanni, Göring would later admit during interrogation that German fuses were a mere 3 or 4 months from full-scale production when the war finally ended. The 25th of December 1944 brought no respite for the holidays. German units attempting to use Christmas Day for resupply and reorganization quickly discovered that proximity fuses observed no ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and troop assembly areas came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers to direct the fire. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, the vast majority of them proximity-fused. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared. The ability to fire effectively without any observation, in abysmal weather, and during the dead of night transformed artillery from a daylight weapon into a constant 24-hour threat. The psychological impact of this was severe. German soldiers had long learned to move and resupply during periods of poor weather when Allied aircraft were grounded and observers couldn't spot them. Proximity fuses completely eliminated this sanctuary. Now death could arrive at any moment, in any weather, with no warning beyond the brief, terrifying whistle of incoming shells. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzény's elite commandos launched an attempt to capture Malmedy. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were specially selected troops who had daringly rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and had successfully infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms. They represented the absolute best that Germany could field. They were met with a storm of devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that transformed their clever American disguises from a tactical advantage into their death shrouds. The shells exploded overhead with an uncanny, almost sentient precision, as if they could somehow detect the impostors cowering below. While exact casualty figures for this engagement remain disputed, the attack failed catastrophically, with such heavy losses that it effectively ended Skorzény's offensive operations. The psychological breakdown among these elite SS troops proved particularly significant. These were soldiers who had been indoctrinated with fanatical beliefs in German superiority and trained to the highest possible standards. Yet they found themselves utterly helpless against the cold indifference of American technology. Some survivors reportedly broke completely, charging directly towards the American lines, preferring a quick death to the continued, inescapable bombardment. A total collapse of military discipline among Hitler's most fanatical troops. The production miracle that stood behind the proximity fuse was the equal of any wartime industrial achievement. By December 1944, over 100 American companies had completely converted their operations to fuse production. The Crosley Corporation abandoned refrigerator manufacturing to take up fuse assembly. Emerson Radio retooled its entire production line from home electronics to weapons of war. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire facilities to the program. The level of quality control exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the 130 components underwent rigorous individual testing. Every single solder joint was meticulously inspected under magnification. Random samples were taken from the production line and actually fired from cannons to ensure their survival under combat conditions. The rejection rate was ruthless. Any component showing even the slightest deviation was immediately discarded. The workforce, composed predominantly of women, maintained this incredible level of precision while working grueling 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Due to strict security compartmentalization, they could not know the true nature of what they were making. They only knew that it was vital to the war effort. By December of 1944, they were producing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds, around the clock. The cost reduction achieved through this efficiency was remarkable. In 1942, a single fuse cost $730, more than an average worker's annual salary. By December 1944, relentless mass production had driven the cost down to just $18 per unit, all while maintaining the highest standards of quality. This incredible efficiency allowed for the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 of them being deployed during the Battle of the Bulge alone. General Patton understood the value of the proximity fuse better than perhaps any other commander. His Third Army, driving to relieve Bastogne, used them as a primary breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed entirely new tactics specifically designed to maximize the employment of proximity fuses. Williams pioneered the time-on-target concentration, using multiple battalions firing simultaneously so that all their shells arrived on the target at the exact same instant. When dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at their optimal height, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers grimly called it the bell toll of death. In the single week between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired an incredible 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The results were decisive in shattering German resistance and blasting open the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself would later write, with his characteristic bluntness, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." The battle for Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated the proximity fuse's power at its absolute maximum effectiveness. Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held a critical piece of terrain against the full might of the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over a brutal three-day period from December 17th to the 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, with approximately 40,000 of those being proximity-fused. These 25% of the shells fired accounted for an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. Proximity fuses had multiplied American firepower by a factor of 4. The German attacks, launched repeatedly up the steep forested slopes, were met by impenetrable walls of air-bursting steel. Entire companies seemed to vanish in seconds, their bodies piled so thickly that subsequent waves of attackers had to physically climb over the mounds of their own dead. After 3 horrific days, the attacks simply ceased. The elite of the Waffen-SS had been broken by American technology. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack involving 900 fighters against Allied airfields. The surprise on the ground was complete, catching many Allied aircraft parked and vulnerable. But as the returning German pilots flew home, they were met by solid walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, an astounding 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, most of them employing proximity fuses. The resulting kill rate stunned both sides. German pilots, who were expertly trained to evade predictive anti-aircraft fire, found that the shells were now detonating precisely where they would inflict the most catastrophic damage. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by years of attrition, never recovered from these devastating losses. By early January 1945, maintaining the secrecy of the weapon had become utterly impossible. Too many shells had been fired, and too many soldiers on both sides had witnessed their unbelievable effects. On January 6, the War Department authorized a limited disclosure to the public. The New York Times reported on a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns. Without explaining the underlying technology, German intelligence finally grasped the weapon's true significance, but it was far too late. A report from Foreign Armies West, dated January 10th, stated grimly, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." Post-war analysis revealed the decisive impact of the proximity fuse in no uncertain terms. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, testified, "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops." The statistics tell the final story. 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, potentially up to 20% of the total German losses in the battle. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition, while requiring no forward observation in poor weather. Behind every cold statistic lay a landscape of human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them mere teenagers conscripted in the final desperate stages of the war, died in ways that traditional warfare had never conceived. They were killed by weapons that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, weapons that could find them wherever they tried to hide. American production workers paid their own price for this victory. Factory accidents were hushed up for security reasons, and workers at Crosley Corporation, Emerson Radio, and other facilities suffered nervous breakdowns from the immense stress and exhaustion. They produced weapons of unprecedented lethality without ever knowing what they were truly making, carrying that silent burden in enforced secrecy. Yet the moral calculation of war is never a simple one. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without the proximity fuse, how many thousands more would have died? How much longer would the war itself have lasted? How many more victims of the Holocaust would have perished while the battles raged on? Every single day the war was shortened, potentially saved thousands of lives in the concentration camps awaiting liberation. The proximity fuse program generated technological advances that utterly transformed the post-war world. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became the foundational components for modern electronics. The rigorous quality control procedures established for fuse production became the new industry standard. The organizational methods used to coordinate hundreds of suppliers pioneered the principles of modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen would later apply his expertise in miniaturization to build satellite instrumentation, leading to his discovery of Earth's radiation belts. The radar principles evolved into the sophisticated systems we use today. The very concept of autonomous sensors making their own decisions became the foundation for guided missiles, and eventually, for all modern smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition in today's arsenals is a direct descendant of the proximity fuse, the very first weapon that could sense its environment and choose for itself the perfect moment to detonate. The revolution that began in the Ardennes continues today on modern battlefields, where smart weapons now dominate warfare. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in a full and final retreat. Hitler's last great offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties, while achieving absolutely none of its strategic objectives. American losses totaled 75,000, including 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself to be not just a new weapon, but a true war winner. General Eisenhower's chilling assessment that German possession of proximity fuses might have made the D-Day landings exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible, underscores their immense strategic importance. They were not merely an improvement to artillery, they were a revolutionary technology that fundamentally and permanently changed the mathematics of warfare. The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused artillery experienced something entirely unprecedented. Death delivered by shells that seemed to be intelligent, that could find them anywhere, and that transformed the very air around them into a killing zone. Their terrifying experience marked warfare's definitive transformation into the technological age. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, the proximity fuse demonstrated that scientific innovation could provide a decisive, battle-winning military advantage. The convergence of American industrial capacity, scientific genius, and tactical adaptation created a weapon that helped determine the final outcome of the war. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story of transformation, technological, tactical, and human. It proved that an industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome a numerical disadvantage, and that the side with superior science would likely prevail in the end. These are the lessons that shaped not just the remainder of World War II, but the entire structure of the warfare that followed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, The age of technological warfare truly and finally arrived. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets encased in artillery shells, forever changing the way that human beings wage war. The German soldiers who died beneath the proximity-fused airbursts were casualties not just of a particular battle, but of a revolution in military affairs that continues to shape our world today.